But I would like to talk first to you children out in the congregation. Maybe your classmates think it's strange that you take off to church for over a week when almost everyone else is in school. Why are you doing such a thing? Why are your parents taking off work on days the world ignores, which are ordinary work days to almost everyone else? Have you ever wished in the back of your mind that they didn't have such an odd religion? For that matter, why are you going to be in church on the upcoming fall holy days? Why are we all going to certain specified places for the Feast of Tabernacles? What does this mean to us? I'd like to come back to this topic and to our children at the end. Nowadays, very few who claim the title of Christian observe God's holy days as outlined in the Bible. It seems that the so-called Christianity of the world has almost totally forgotten these days. And that has been the case since the first few centuries after its establishment. Why do we need to be different? Why do we need to observe these days when it would be much easier to do as the world does, as our classmates and co-workers do? Does the Bible really command Christians to observe these days now? I will not go through Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 16, where the holy days were given to Moses by the one who became Christ. We can read these chapters on our own. We know them. They tell us what the holy days are, and they're not really those chapters are not really an item of controversy. They're not of particular concern here, because the question is whether the holy days are applicable to us under the New Covenant, whether they're supposed to be observed in the New Testament church. My purpose here is to show that the holy days are indeed part of the New Covenant, that they were observed in the church when the New Testament was being written, and that holy day observance is binding on Christians today. We might title this sermon, Holy Days as Part of the New Covenant, with a subtitle, which I will mention later. One of the notorious study papers, which were written by evil men, very evil men, and which were published in 1995 by the former fellowship of most of us. One of these papers tried to dismiss this question out of hand by claiming that Old Testament prophecy could not be used to establish rules for the church in this age. But that sweeping claim does not address the real question. Let us in a scenario, assume that the holy days and the Feast of Tabernacles are indeed not part of the New Covenant. Then let's turn to Zechariah chapter 14. We know this passage also. Zechariah chapter 14, starting in verse 16. And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them there will be no rain. If the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. We'll get a bit into that later. That's an interesting, there's duality in that prophecy. They shall receive the plague with which the Lord strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This is certainly a prophecy speaking of the millennium and afterward. The only way that we can explain the clear statement in these verses, if we think that the holy days are not part of the New Covenant, then the only way to explain these verses is to assume that God will somehow make a third covenant with mankind in the future, which would incorporate observance of these days, which the current new covenant by these people's reasoning does not. But the Bible gives no hint that a third covenant will ever be made, only rather an extension of the new covenant to all of mankind who choose to be a part of it. Hence, we must conclude that the Feast of Tabernacles, and by implication the other holy days also, are indeed part of the new covenant. That's number one. And secondly, they apply to Gentiles under the new covenant. We read there in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 19, actually in verse 18, which I mentioned, the example that Egypt, certainly a Gentile nation, will be penalized if it does not observe the feast. By the way, note also the hidden meaning in that prophecy. Think about it. What would happen nowadays to Egypt if there were no rain there? Nothing. Egypt doesn't get any rain anyway. It's totally dependent on the Nile River, which gets its water from rain falling much farther upstream in Ethiopia and in the East African highlands. But the prophecy indicates that in the millennium, there will indeed be rain-fed agriculture in Egypt. There will be enough rain in what is now the Egyptian Sahara for crops to be grown there, not dependent on the Nile River. And that agriculture will be severely impacted if the rain gets cut off. So we see a dual prophecy there. And we can certainly see the mention of holy day observance in the church in the New Testament. We remember from Acts chapter 2, verse 1, the church was founded on the day of Pentecost. Remember, in the book of Acts, Acts was written by Luke. Who was Luke? Let's turn to Colossians chapter 4. What did Paul say about Luke? Colossians chapter 4. We'll start in verse 7. Paul says here, Tychicus, a beloved brother, faithful minister, and fellow servant in the Lord, will tell you all the news about me. I am sending him to you for this very purpose, that he may know your circumstances and comfort your hearts. With Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother who is one of you, that's apparently the Onesimus from the book of Philemon. They will make known to you all things which are happening here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Paul was admitting here he had misjudged the character of Mark earlier, but continuing in verse 11, and Jesus, who is called Justus. These, look here, these, Paul says, these are my only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are of the circumcision. They have proved to be a comfort to me. Now, go down to verse 14. He talks separately about the others. He says here, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Luke was apparently a Gentile because he was identified separately from those of the circumcision here. And he was apparently the only Gentile writer of the New Testament. All the others were not only Israelites, but were Jews. So we can subtitle the sermon, By the Pen of a Gentile. Most commentators agree that Luke was writing to a predominantly Gentile audience. Both of the books which Luke wrote, the book of Luke and the book of Acts, are addressed to someone named Theophilus, or maybe that was his title, a Greek name generally believed to have belonged to a Gentile. Remember that Gentile Christians had never been under the Old Covenant. And if the day of Pentecost were not familiar to and observed by Gentile Christians, if it were something foreign to them, why would Luke have used it as a point of reference? Let's turn to Acts chapter 20 also. Acts chapter 20. What else did Luke say in Acts chapter 20? In verse 6, Luke said here, referring to him where he was the party of Paul, that where Luke was accompanying Paul. He says, "But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days." The implication here was apparently that they had spent the days of unleavened bread at Philippi. What was special about Philippi compared with the other cities that that Paul visited and preached in? What is special? What was the special significance of Philippi? Let's turn to Acts 16, a few pages back. Acts 16, we'll start in verse 11. Luke said, "Therefore, sailing from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and the next day came to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the foremost city of that part of Macedonia, a Roman colony. And we were staying in that city for some days. And on the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside, where prayer was customarily made, and we sat down and spoke to the women who met there." And then talks about the conversion of Lydia. Philippi was a Roman colony, a town in Greece which was populated largely by settlers from Rome, as we read. Remember that in most cities to which Paul traveled for the first time, he would first go to the local synagogue to preach the gospel first to the Jews in that city. There are many examples of that. Acts 13, verse 5, a city of Salamis in Cyprus. Acts 13, verses 13 through 41, Pisidian Antioch. Acts 14, verse 1, the city of Iconium. Acts 17, verses 1 through 4, Thessalonica. Acts 17, verse 10, Berea. Acts 17, Athens. Acts 18, verse 4, Corinth. And Acts 19, verse 8, Ephesus. In all of those cities, Paul went to the synagogue first to preach the gospel, to reach the local Jews first. But we just read here in Acts 16, in Philippi, Paul went instead first to a place by the riverside where people who were apparently the local Jewish population would gather to pray. The implication here was that there were not even enough Jews in Philippi to form a synagogue. I think there had to be at least 12 Jewish men to form a synagogue. Apparently there weren't. Hence, one can draw the conclusion that apparently very few Jews lived in Philippi. It was Roman settlers. One might also note something else. In most of the cities on Paul's journeys, the persecution against him was spearheaded by Jews who opposed the preaching of the gospel. Examples: Pisidian Antioch, Acts 14, verse 45, Iconium, Acts 14, verse 2, Lystra, Acts 14, verse 19, Thessalonica, Acts 17, verses 5 through 9, Berea, Acts 17, verse 13, and Corinth, Acts 18, verses 12 through 17. The persecution of Paul in all of those cities was spearheaded by local Jews who opposed his preaching. But Philippi was different. Let's skip down to Acts 16, where we are in Acts 16. Let's skip down to verse 20. We'll start in verse 19. When God, through Paul, had driven a demon out of a girl, a slave girl. Verse 19. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. And they brought them to the magistrates and said, "These men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city, and they teach customs which are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or observe." The persecution of Paul in Philippi, very different from the other cities, was started by Roman Gentiles who complained that Paul was a troublemaker and a Jew. The city of Philippi was different. Since there were very few Jews within the pool of potential converts in Philippi, the church congregation at Philippi was almost certainly overwhelmingly Gentile. Given these points, why would Paul and his party have chosen Philippi as a place to spend the days of unleavened bread if the holy days were not for Gentile Christians to observe? And also remember that Luke said that we, including Luke himself, who was a Gentile, sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. Luke had stayed at Philippi with Paul or some of his party, and had obviously observed the festival with the brethren there. Let's turn to Acts 20, a few pages over. What else did Luke write? Acts 20, verse 16. For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he would not have to spend time in Asia, as referring to a province in Asia Minor, not the whole continent. Continuing, for he was hurrying to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. He was hurrying to be at Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Of course, he ran, as we know, he ran into trouble there and was taken out as a prisoner. So what happened to the ship bearing Paul as a prisoner? Let's turn to Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. We'll start in verse 7, referring to the ship. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidos, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives." If they hadn't followed his advice, which they did to some extent, the people were saved on the ship. Their lives were saved. Commentators generally, they were sailing after the fast. Commentators generally agree that Luke almost certainly was referring to the Day of Atonement. Similarly here, if Gentile Christians were not familiar with the Day of Atonement as a result of having observed it, why would Luke use it as a point of reference? To do so would be as absurd as for an American writing for a European audience to use as a point of reference Thanksgiving Day, which is unknown in Europe, or Labor Day, which is May 1st to most Europeans. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We'll go as a very familiar scripture. We'll start in verse 7. Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened, for indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Paul commanded the church at Corinth, which almost certainly was predominantly Gentile, to observe the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. And of course, in verse 7, the Passover is mentioned by name. And the use of unleavened bread, literally and figuratively, is commanded in verse 8. We note also in verse 2, what did Paul say about the Corinthians? And you are puffed up, and if not rather mourned, that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. He said they were puffed up. They were puffed up like leavened bread. What would have been the significance of these points had the people not been observing the days of unleavened bread? As we read in verse 7, Paul said, you truly are unleavened. They were unleavened physically, but not yet spiritually. However, the skeptic might argue, if the church was indeed observing the holy days, and its members, both Jew and Gentile, were completely familiar with them, then why did John, the Apostle John, refer to two of the holy day seasons as feasts of the Jews in John 2, verse 13, chapter 6, verse 4, and chapter 7, verse 2? There are a number of possible answers there. First, remember that John was written considerably after the other gospel accounts, at a time when new converts were overwhelmingly Gentile. If indeed the book was addressed primarily to new Christians or those just coming into contact with Christianity, those of Gentile background would have had no prior familiarity with the holy days, except perhaps a knowledge that the Jews observed them. Second, recall that John repeatedly uses the term the Jews not to refer to the Jewish people as a whole, but to the top religious leaders at that time. We can turn to John chapter 7. John chapter 7, verse 1. After these days, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. Again, not referring to the Jewish people as a whole, but to the religious leaders. Verse 11. Then the Jews, again, the religious leaders, sought him at the feast and said, where is he? The religious leaders carried out important jobs during the holy days, particularly the priests in connection with the sacrificial system. We might note that another feast which the Jewish people observed, but one which is not commanded in the Bible and which did not contain a holy day, was also called a feast of the Jews. Let's turn page over to chapter 2 pages over to chapter 10 of John. John chapter 10, verse 22. Now it was the feast of dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. It was Hanukkah. That was a feast that the Jews observed, but one which was not commanded, and it was not referred to as a feast of the Jews there. It didn't contain a holy day. But in any case, nowhere does John say that holy day observance is not required for Christians, or that the church did not observe the days. We remember from Leviticus 23, they're still the feasts of the Lord, and John certainly recorded that Jesus observed them. Also, the skeptic might ask, how about when Paul criticizes the Galatians for observing days, months, seasons, and years? Let's turn to Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4, verse 10. Paul said, "You observe days and months and seasons and years." Does this mean, as so many believe, that he was criticizing them for observing the Sabbath and the holy days? But let's look at the context. Let's go back to verse 8. Paul said to the Galatians, "For then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those which by nature are not gods. But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage?" They're talking about days of pagan origin. We saw they were turning back to those which are, by nature are not gods, the weak and beggarly elements. This could not have been referring to the feasts of the Lord, as we can read in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 1. And also remember, he said the Galatians were observing months and seasons. There are no entire months or seasons set apart by God, either in Leviticus 23 or Deuteronomy 16. There are certainly holy days in the 7th month, but the entire month is not holy. How about another passage that is quoted by the skeptics? Let's turn to Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2. We will start in verse 16. Paul says to the Colossians, "So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come. But," poor translation here, "the substance is of Christ." We'll get into why that's a poor translation. But do these verses mean, as so much of the world thinks, that Gentile Christians were not keeping the holy days or were not keeping the Sabbath and were being judged by so-called Judaizers who wanted them to do so? Let's look back at the verse closely. The word translated substance in verse 17 is actually the Greek word for body. It is soma. Strong's Greek word number 4983. It's the word from which we got words such as somatic or psychosomatic. And the word is not in the original Greek. Hence the passage should really read, "So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body of Christ," the church. The Colossian Christians were not to fear being judged by those in the outside world. A modern analogy, recall what we were talking about at the beginning of the sermon. Modern analogy might be the child whose classmates say, "What are you doing?" when he tells them that he will be gone during the Feast of Tabernacles. The real problem that the Colossians were having is shown down in verses 20 through 22. We'll read them. Verse 20, Paul says, "Therefore, if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, you subject yourself to regulations? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with the using." Now here's the clincher. Continuing, "according to the commandments and doctrines of men." They were, as though living in the world, subjecting themselves to rules according to the commandments and doctrines of men. These basic principles of the world, which Paul mentions in verse 20, are quite likely the same as the weak and beggarly elements, which he mentioned in Galatians chapter 4, verse 9. The unnecessary rules the Colossians were observing were of human origin. They had nothing to do with whether one should keep the holy days as commanded by God. I told you at the beginning, I would get back to the children. Children, when we take off from school to observe God's festivals, when we leave home for 8 days a few weeks from now, we're obeying the commandment of God in keeping the feasts of the Lord in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 1. You and your parents are pioneers, doing something that will someday be required of all mankind. We are pioneers, not because of our own goodness, but because God chose us and in his grace showed us the truth. As pioneers, we are sometimes persecuted and judged by the outside world because it does not yet understand, but someday it will, and so will all mankind, when all people of all nations will keep the Feast of Tabernacles, as we read in Zechariah 14.